Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is Brown versus the Board of Education, Segregation and Civil Rights. We're fortunate to have with us to talk about the Brown decision of 1954, segregation, and the civil rights movement that flowed out of the Brown decision, Dr. RMitchell, a professor at Fisk University and an individual, Dr. Mitchell, I might say, who has made a tremendous contribution to comments with Dr. James Haney by the many shows that we've had an opportunity to deal with you. Dr. Mitchell, let's see if we might be able, before we start today talking about Brown v. Board of Education and the civil rights movement, let's have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in terms of leading you to where we are today.
Well, Dr. Haney, it's certainly been a pleasure to have been asked on so many occasions to be able to enter the conversation and dialogue with you over the last, I guess, 15 years now. Actually, this year I celebrated my 25th anniversary at Fisk. I've been at Fisk for 25 years. I did my undergraduate work at Fisk. My degrees are from Tennessee State and Middle Tennessee State and postdoctoral studies at Harvard. But for 25 years I've served a myriad of capacities at Fisk. But I've always been in the classroom. Served as vice president, assistant to the president, and dean of academic affairs. But I've always taken a particular pride and pleasure in teaching bright young people, because that's what I think higher education is really about.
Dr. Mitchell, you know, what we've tried to do over the last 4 or 5 shows is to recognize that May the 4th of 2004 is the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. And we wanted to at least recognize that anniversary by having a series of television shows dealing with certain aspects of Brown. I think we have to admit up front personally that we believe that the Brown decision is just about the most important decision made since the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And what we'd like to do today is to have you to give us some information to sort of flow in to the other shows that we've had. We've already dealt with Brown and the law with Dr. Attorney Blackshear. We've dealt with Brown and public education in the South with Ms. Linda Wynn and Dr. Lewis Baldwin. And we've also dealt with Brown and diversity with the persons from Tennessee State University, Dr. Coleman McGinnis and Dr. Raymond Richardson, as well as Mr. Mark Gunter. And so in a real sense, you represent the 4th attempt at Brown versus the Board of Education dealing with civil rights, simply indicating that not only do we wish to celebrate the 50th anniversary, but we recognize the significance of this decision, not only in diversity, but almost in every aspect. And so let's have you to start talking about one important element in Brown, and that is the separation of the races.
Well, Brown attempted to remedy what had been standard in the United States even before it was the United States. That is the separation of people by race. Initially, African Americans were enslaved. And during that enslavement, it was very important to deny certain aspects because it's difficult to keep people enslaved when they're educated. So in the colonial period, in the period before the Civil War, there were laws opposing education for African Americans. So that had become ingrained in America. Even after the Civil War, the great victory which would bring about with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ideally it brought about the end of legal slavery. It made me free, but unfortunately it didn't make me equal. It didn't give me any parity. So in a South and in a North after the war, there's still a separation of people based upon race, a denial of opportunity. This had been the de facto case, and then you have the very, very famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. People can be separated based upon race. How much black blood makes you subject to be a Negro? 1 drop, 1 degree. What Plessy said was it established the principle, the really un-American principle of separate but equal. How can you really have things separate but equal? From a common sense standpoint, that just doesn't work out, especially when you expect the majority group to provide equally for the minority group. So Plessy versus Ferguson established constitutionally the separation of the races and second-class status for African Americans. That will not be addressed. Plessy versus Ferguson was 1896, and that will not be addressed, not overturned until 1954 with the Brown decision.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Mitchell, let us make preparations for this first commercial break. And when we come back, I think you have us in the Plessy era.
Yes.
And so what we'd like for you to do during the second segment is to give our young people, more than anything, people who might not have lived through that experience,
right,
some idea of what it meant to be segregated in the period prior to 1954. We'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is Brown versus the Board of Education and segregation and the Civil Rights Movement. And we have with us to talk about segregation and the Civil Rights Movement in the context of the Brown decision of 1954, Dr. RMitchell from Fisk University. And of course, Dr. Mitchell, let's see if we can start this second segment by having you to give us some kind of graphic information relative to the separation of the races. I think we've talked about it from the point of view of Plessy and law and et cetera, but having grown up in the southern parts of the United States, talk about it from that perspective.
Especially in the South, but throughout the country. The great hope that the Civil War would end second-class status for African Americans. But unfortunately, when the Civil War ended, racism, as we know it, becomes ingrained, especially in the South, but throughout the country. The great advantage that had been given to whites being free was now transposed to the fact that you're white. So black people, African Americans, were in a second-class mode. We couldn't break out of it. We had served valiantly in the Civil War. We had attempted after the war to go to work to gain our admission into the American system. World War I comes about after Plessy, 1896. But World War I, we fight valiantly. We go over. We hope that we will be, again, ingrained within the American system. But what happens? African-American soldiers return. Several of them are lynched in uniform. You have the famous Red Summer, 1919 after the war, where African-Americans in Chicago are stoned when they drift across a line, black water, white water, or colored water, white water. Young boys are stoned. In Texas, young soldiers are lynched in their uniforms. So America again to reinforce separation and race and second-class citizenship for African Americans. You know, Dr. Haney, I think the real turning point was World War II, though. The generation of the baby boomers' fathers, my father, your father, and others, they go and they fight. They come back, and they understand they want to make the promise of America real for all Americans. In post-World War II, the GI Bill, chances for education, people aren't willing to accept, black people are willing to accept inherent segregation and inferiority. So in the case of Linda Brown, her father, he wants better for his children than he had. He believes that in a segregated school system, that black children are going to receive a second-class education. He asked the question, why should I pay taxes? Why should I pay first-class taxes and my children receive a second-class education? So he challenges the American system. He challenges Plessy versus Ferguson, the whole idea of separate but equal. In a landmark decision, this case will reach the Supreme Court. And as a professor, you teach, and we're all well, and some of us are well, not every case makes it to the Supreme Court, but this would be a landmark decision. The court looks at it, the court hears the case, and the court decides that in America, you can't have people separated out by race. You might separate them out by other entities, but not by race. And to have a whole class of people cast in the second-class status because of their race is found to be unconstitutional. In this country, when we say something is unconstitutional, that means it goes against the American Constitution. So in a larger sense, it's really un-American. It doesn't fit the ideals that we put forth as American values and American ideals. And African Americans weighed in. First, it's Brown, it's education, and many see the Brown decision as the beginnings, or one of the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. Because once these children enter these schools and they feel they're receiving a quality education, why should they then submit to second-class status? Brown opens a discussion in America. Brown opens a discussion of what America means and what the American promise is. And really, after Brown, there's really no turning back.
Very good. And of course, one of the things, Dr. Mitchell, that we noticed, and I think that you've indicated here, is that out of Brown would come the civil rights movement. Why don't you say something about the effort on the part of the South to sort of block the implementation of Brown?
Well, the real implication in the South is to have a whole class of people who receive second-class education, who are understood to be second class. They are a second-class labor force. They are going to be the labor force of the South. But ironically, too, race and second-class status offered a comfort level to the South. It meant that you could tell the white South and the poor white Southerner, well, if you have nothing else, at least you have superiority over these people. And that's a sad reflection, Dr. Haney, on America. As the rest of the world studies United States history and the rest of the world is aware of the Brown decision, many times persons in other parts of the world view a disdain first for educated Americans and possibly for educated African Americans, because they wonder, how can we be loyal when we've been treated so poorly by our nation? And you know, the irony, if you look at citizenship among African Americans, or patriotism or support, we've been among the very best citizens in the country. The first man who died in what was later would become the American Revolution was Crispus Attucks, a runaway slave, but he's suddenly a patriot when he dies for the cause. If you look at the American Revolution, Prince Whipple, Peter Salem and Salem Point, all those black patriots who participated. You know, there's never been a time when there's been an American war that African Americans haven't participated valiantly and served their country, from the Spanish-American War. And right now, people are still astounded by the motion picture Glory, because people didn't understand that African-American males fought valiantly. We've always been good Americans. You've never seen black folk protesting on the 4th of July. You've never seen black folk protesting around the Statue of Liberty. You'd have no discussions of black college students going to Canada to evade war. When this series was shot, we were just a day or two after income tax, and black people have been willing to pay for their equality, because you've never seen African-American tax protesters. Those who've been given the least have been the most supported. But Brown opened the door for that. Brown made America keep one of its promises to its brown sons and daughters, and that was for education and the possibility of a first-class education in America.
You know, Dr. Mitchell, and we're getting ready for the our first commercial break, our second commercial break here. But one of the things that we'd like to deal with is to look at the relationship between Brown and the civil rights movement. You see, because I think the decision is rendered in 1954.
Exactly.
And it is not until 1960. So that's about 6 years of intense discussion, intense debate.
But you also have time to grow 6 years of young people to become a catalyst for that movement.
That's exactly it, and that's what we want you to speak to when we come back during this
we will look at that.
third segment about the impact that those long years before the enforcement had upon the decision itself. Of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. The topic is Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement, and we're talking to Dr. RMitchell. Dr. Mitchell, as we promised before we had ended our second segment, that we'd give you an opportunity to talk about that critical period between 1954 and the 1960s, with the beginning of the so-called Civil Rights Movement, this period of massive resistance and et cetera. Talk about some of the historical developments in that particular period.
I certainly want to set the stage, but in a conversation with my son Roman, who's 12 years old, who's a student, Roman reminded me that we needed to point out about who Brown was. We referred to Brown. Linda Brown. And he reminded me that Linda Brown had to walk about 2 miles to school every day, and her father became upset because in Topeka, Kansas, where they lived, they walked past a school that white students could attend. And it's very poignant. Linda Brown is still out on the circuit. She's still lecturing. But she pointed out that she asked her father one